This is What on Earth is Going On, a show that was originally broadcast on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. Visit the website www.wogoshow.com. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Hey, my name is Ben Charland. Welcome to another episode of What on Earth is Going On, your weekly podcast for a world in flux. We've got a great show for you today. An interview with Tricia Baldwin, the director of the Isabel Bader Centre for the Performing Arts in Kingston, Ontario. Tricia and I have a terrific conversation about art, the purpose of art, and how to program an arts organization such as the Isabel in Kingston to make sure that it's relevant, on the edge, and making an important contribution to the ongoing dialogue. We're going to get to the interview in just a moment, but before we do, I wanted to ask you a favor. Please get in touch. Let me know what you think about this show. Give me your feedback and your suggestions. I'd love to hear what you want to hear on this show. What kind of guests should be interviewed? What kind of subjects should be tackled? And if you can, please spread the word about the show. Put it out on social media. Give it a rating on iTunes or Facebook or whatever podcast app that you use. Keep the conversation going. Now, without further ado, here is Tricia Baldwin. Tricia Baldwin is the director of the Isabel Bader Centre for the Performing Arts in Kingston. She is an award-winning manager of arts organizations across Canada, such as Toronto's Tafel Music Baroque Orchestra, Ballet British Columbia, and the Kingston Symphony. Tricia is a fixture of the community in Kingston and an important voice for the arts in Canada. Tricia, thanks for coming on the program.
I'm so happy to be here.
Excellent. So, it seems that we live in turbulent times and that our world is in flux, whether it's the drastic impacts of advancing technology or the near constant disruptions in business and politics, or the gradual but ultimately more consequential shift in how we perceive the world around us. Now, all of this is quite hard to get a grip on, and of course there are articles and books and podcasts like this one to help us digest it all, but there is also dance, drama, music, poetry, and art. We don't gather together in great halls to hear newspapers read out loud, but we do go to them to hear some music and poetry. I want to talk with you about this sense of community and the role of art in our world today. But first, as always, I'm going to start with that usual question. Tricia, what on earth is going on?
I think the world is going through a tremendous churn, and we're seeing just the diversification of more extreme political views, and we're seeing the handover of institutions from the baby boomers to the next generation. So this is a very big change in terms of establishing our values and working within an international context rather than a parochial context, because we're very aware of what's happening internationally and especially with our neighbors to the south.
What do you mean by that, like international as opposed to parochial?
Well, I remember doing some research. I was one of the co-creators of the MA in Arts Leadership program at Queen's, and we went and did market research with arts leaders across Canada to say, is there a gap in some of the qualities of the Canadian arts worker? And one of the things that came out is sometimes Canadians look in their own backyard for solutions rather than looking internationally at best practices and solutions. And so I think we've got great quality of life in Canada, but right now there are so many international factors determining the future of the world that Canada needs to be on the world stage and needs to be part of the international dialogue.
So you're talking about this churn that's happening in the world, and I think it's self-evident, whether we're picking up a newspaper or just watching things change around us. What role, if any, do the arts have to play in that?
The arts have a tremendous role in social change, and you could see that through the centuries. You could see that even with socialism in the 20th century and the workers developing a voice, and that was actually reflected a lot through visual art and through literature. I just think that socially engaged arts is an experiential approach to human rights, and it allows people to walk in somebody else's shoes. So, for instance, if you're reading literature about somebody's experience, if an Indigenous person's experience in the residential schools, we can read a lot in the media, but when you're reading the literature or seeing a play, you become that person and you realize how terrifying it would be to be torn away from your family. And so I think we understand a lot more. There's a lot of truth that is spoken through literature, through music, through plays, and through art that allows us to understand somebody else's predicament. And we become a lot more empathetic when we understand it on an individual level and through our gut and heart, and not just an intellectual understanding and a removed understanding of very difficult human rights situations in the world.
So when you're developing a program, say at the Isabel Bader, or when you used to work in Toronto or Ballet British Columbia, when you're developing the kind of things that are going to go onto the stage, are you looking for empathy? Are you looking for stories that bring people in and perhaps show a different perspective? Is that a key piece? That's
one of the key pieces, and especially we established the Isabel Human Rights Arts Festival to do just that. And we've been working with students who have developed fabulous programs within the Human Rights Arts Festival to talk about the underheard racialized voices on the Queen's campus. And so, and it's the very first exhibit that students did talked about invisible disabilities such as very severe depression, but basically giving a voice to underheard voices. And when you read the poetry and see the exhibits that they've created, you do have empathy and you realize what it must be like when you're suffering in such pain and the world is not listening. And I think the arts really bring that home. And especially in the 21st century, when you see, children in cages and being separated from their parents, that you see a photograph and the photograph of the little girl crying, all of a sudden $8 million was raised through Facebook to make sure that that families could get united. But that photograph, or the photograph of the little boy on the beach who was escaping from Syria, all of a sudden the world changed and said this cannot happen. But those individual experiences and stories that are told are basically the ones that change the world. Even if we go back to World War II, when the Diary of Anne Frank was discovered, we understood what happened with the Holocaust through the eyes of a little girl who was completely innocent but was in very difficult and horrific times. And I just thought that all of a sudden people understood what happened and the essential wrong of the Holocaust and of racial profiling and genocide.
Yeah, I think that's a key word that you use, that is story. I mean, whether it's the photo of the boy on the beach or the photo of the little girl who is separated from her parents or the stories of Anne Frank, I mean, what we're seeing is a story being told that shifts our paradigm, our perspective of the world. And so I guess when you're looking for these stories that move people, whether it's through poetry or drama or dance or music, like a form, say, like classical music, where there often are no words to guide us, where we're simply having our feelings moved by the music, but there's still a story being told. So how do you maximize and capitalize on that?
It's interesting because there's so many different roles of the art, and in terms of social justice, they are tremendous tools of persuasion. And, you look at during the McCarthy era, the plays that were being written about Salem to actually say this is the witch hunt that's happening in our current times.
Yeah, the Arthur Miller play.
Exactly. And so you look at that, but you also look at, on the positive side of humanity, our great achievements in civilization and our great potential to achieve excellence and something that's sublime. And so if you're, programming something with a fantastic artist playing Bach or Mozart, that this is kind of the pinnacle of achievement, or a brand new work that is just so creative that I think we have to fuel our creativity, because the human creativity actually solves a world's problems too, but it produces something quite wonderful to celebrate about being fully human.
And that finding the human and uncovering the human is so important for the arts.
Exactly. Whether it's in the Sistine Chapel, there's just something so inspiring about what we're able to create when we put our energies to something that is really sublimely beautiful.
I don't know if you know of the scholar Harold Bloom.
Yes.
And he actually had a theory.
I read 2 of his books about the closing of the American mind.
Right.
And
there's one fascinating concept that I've always returned to, that Shakespeare, in writing Hamlet and other plays, which can be seen from a humanist perspective,
yes,
really invented the human. And his point is that in Hamlet's monologue, to be or not to be,
yes,
and other monologues in Shakespeare, there's this sense that for the first time, a person is in one state of mind, has a conversation with themselves.
Yeah.
We may be privy to that conversation, but the dialogue is internal.
Yes.
And by the end of that soliloquy, that monologue, they've changed their mind. They've decided to take a new path, take a new action. And that is human and humanist in the sense that we don't just react to our environment, we're capable of reacting to our inner selves.
And reflecting.
And that was almost the critical revolution of Shakespeare that shifted our paradigm at that time. And when we look at the arts today, I think we see a lot of potential for that too.
Exactly. Even in Mozart's operas, he was one of the first independent musicians that was free of the court and free of the church to actually create himself. And he wrote The Marriage of Figaro, and very beautiful music and an entertaining plot line. But he was actually poking fun of the aristocracy, but he didn't make it kind of white hat, black hat, good and evil, because he made all the classes involved. They all had their foibles, and he had this great ability to show the humanity in everybody and all our imperfections that make us lovable and annoying and all of that. But he really understood the human being with all our challenges, and he didn't exaggerate positions at all, but he gave us insight into positions and into our own imperfections and into our own beauty and our seeking of love and beauty.
And you can hear that in music that have no words. You can feel that experience.
It can be abstract.
So this is a question that a lot of people ask artists and arts administrators is, if I listen to Mozart and I don't, so I think I do hear that, but I know a lot of people who don't. They listen to Mozart or Beethoven or Bach, and they don't get the story. They just hear sound. Maybe sometimes it's pretty, maybe sometimes it's a bit too angry or heavy, but that's about it. How much training or conditioning or learning is involved to get to that point, or how much is art supposed to be more intuitive and basic?
That is a very complex question. I think we all relate to different art forms and different genres, and that's actually the beauty. We have a world that should be celebrating diversity, and diversity happens in different genres of music, for example. And I fell in love with music being on the hill of Ontario Place, hearing Seiji Ozawa conduct Beethoven's Fifth. And it was so powerful to me. I went and got my babysitting money, and I went down to Sam the Record Man and bought the Vienna Philharmonic playing Beethoven's Fifth. And I was so blown away by it. I kind of got bitten by the music bug.
Right.
And I ended up dedicating my life to it. And so I was personally touched by the power of that music. And so I think it often depends on our experience as young people, what we relate to. And a lot of studies have actually shown if different people, influential people in your life kind of guide you to different experiences, you actually have more insight and more openness to experience that. So I would say to anybody, keep your mind open and try to experience different genres that may not be initially your favorite, because something will happen that the penny will drop and some beautiful experience will happen because you've been open. Last night I was hearing Be Rich, the rapper Be Rich, and I had the best time ever. And I didn't know I was going to have the best time ever. But I loved his energy. I loved the way that he was relating to the audience. I loved his creativity. But if I hadn't gone beyond my own comfort zone, I would have never known that.
Right.
So I think it's really keeping open to the ability to experience different art forms and just different experiences. And I would say not just in Western art, in the international arts, there's so many brilliant artists from around the world, try to understand different cultures through their music, because you'll learn a lot that way. But it is kind of the basic piece of advice I would say is be curious.
And is that might be a segue into the question, how do you bring new people in, new energy, new audiences to keep the art living and fresh? How do you do that as an administrator of the arts?
That's great, because I'm working with so many young people who are making music. And so one of the things that we try to do at the Isabel is we want to make sure for the university that the students actually see themselves reflected on stage. They see themselves reflected in terms of artists their age and artists of different cultures. And we've been working with some of the great competitions around the world to really champion the emerging artists who have just phenomenal talent. And I think it's really important in our society to go for excellence. And just like we see it in the Olympics, in a way, music is like the Olympics, and you can see somebody who's really dedicated themselves and just gone for it. And I think in reflecting an age group on our stage actually helps with the audience going into a concert, that they're seeing somebody their age performing. And I think in general in music, what we're trying to do is add the social back into music, because you can get anything online, but the live experience is so much more visceral and so much more powerful. So we're working with Queen's International Centre with a program that they come to a number of concerts. We have a reception before, we have the artists come and speak, and anybody can ask any kind of questions. But putting the social back into the arts, I think, is a very important point. I also think that the creativity in the 21st century is between genres. So we're doing a lot of multi-genre art, and I think that is going to be exciting for the next generation, because there's just a lot of imagination that's going into that you can see multimedia reflections and interpretations of abstract music of Beethoven or Mozart or Stravinsky on stage. So that creativity and trying to find different performance practices and styles will be interesting to explore.
And when you say multi-genre, are you talking about obviously taking Mozart or Stravinsky and putting it on stage in a different way, but I guess you're also talking about different disciplines,
right?
Bringing dance and drama and visual art together in one whole.
We had this really interesting program. It was a bit cerebral, but it was quite powerful. Do you know Dietrich Bonhoeffer? So he basically was a conscientious objector to the Nazi movement during World War II, and he's a brilliant theologian, and he could have had a great job away from Germany during that time in an Ivy League university, but he chose to be in the lion's den. And this very kind of strict theologian ended up participating in the plot to assassinate Hitler, and he was put into jail. And he wrote these poems, and the poems started off quite cerebral, but then they got more and more personal as he was facing his execution. And so we combined that with the music of Bach. So R.H. Thompson was reading the poems and giving some background, and then the music happened. And our tech director put these lights behind the organ, and he just, over a 10-minute period, lit the ceiling slowly with this yellow glowing light. And by the end, we were all completely bathed in this glowing light, and we felt like, have we reached heaven or something?
Right.
But that would have been different than going to an organ recital.
Right.
It gave it context.
Yeah. It's funny because I think one of the challenges that art has is that it's mixed with, quote unquote, entertainment.
Yeah.
That art can be subversive, and it probably should be dangerous and compel us and propel us to take action when we see things that are wrong.
But it also can make us happy.
Right.
Like, music is written in major and minor keys because that's our human experience. We need sadness and we need happiness to be human.
Right. And I guess that's my question, is that a lot of art can simply make us happy. I mean, it's a lot of people would consider a show like Keeping Up with the Kardashians, I don't even know if it's still on, as to be art. Yeah. The people who are making the show, who are behind the camera, who are cutting the scenes together. I mean, these people are artists, whether with that show or with other things. Yeah. But entertainment can be a distraction too, and can pull us away from what's really going on, whether through fantasy or just because I'd rather not think about it. So, I mean, how do we keep that balance between the desire to be entertained and be made happy, but also the feeling like we're talking about real things happening to real people and real stories?
I think it's always going to be a variety, because we do need the ability to escape. And there's nothing wrong with being entertained, but maybe it's through our education system that we are giving ourselves the opportunity to be challenged and to be moved. And I think that is very, very important to stress, especially during these times, that instead of just escaping from the problems of the world, we actually have a duty as a human being to be informed. And I think the arts actually provide a forum for people to actually start to understand an issue and start to be able to commit to some kind of social action to rectify that social issue that is happening. And it's actually a very creative way to really engage people's imaginations in what the possibilities for the future could be. And I just think that the arts play a tremendously important role in that. And now that you're seeing all these collaborations between cultures and between disciplines happening, I think that's actually a very healthy thing for the arts, because every art form has their paradigm. I studied clarinet. I was a classical musician, and so I joke that I think with my ears, right?
Okay,
and so then when I was with Halfle Music, we started to partner with filmmakers, and they were thinking with their eyes, and they were thinking thematically and talking about the arc of storytelling. Then we started partnering with musicians of different cultures, some with a written music tradition and some with not. And so we learned so much, because that different paradigm was fascinating. I remember one time we were working with an opera director, and he was teaching the musicians how to move. But it was really fascinating, because we actually hadn't thought of physical movement on stage. And at one point, when a musician wasn't playing, he was looking kind of bored, and basically the theater director, the opera director, had said, the audience is going to look at the most bored person on the stage. So when you're not playing, you place your attention to the person who's playing the solo. And because the music training was basically an ear experience and a heart experience, that was really great to actually learn from somebody who actually thought very visually and very viscerally from a physical perspective.
Right.
And I think that's going to be great for classical music, because that animation of what's happening on stage. And throughout time, there's always been different performance practices. You mentioned Shakespeare. People were coming in with food and drink and talking throughout. It was a very different experience than the hushed experience. And I think in the 21st century, we're going to come up with different formats of concerts that actually give more flexibility for audience members of different ages and stages to actually experience the art.
Well, one of the most fun I've ever had, some of the most fun I've ever had with classical music was with the Simon Bolivar Orchestra, led by Gustavo Dudamel.
Yeah.
And the music is the same.
Yeah.
They're doing Beethoven, they're doing Shostakovich, they're doing Tchaikovsky.
Yeah.
But the way in which they play, the energy they bring to it on stage is infectious and powerful. And the format is quite close to the same, other than the fact that at the end they take off their costumes and they have these the jackets, the colors of Venezuela, which is they're such wonderful moments. But again, the music is the same. The reinvention is the attitude.
Exactly. And you see that at different stages where you see musicians playing like there's no tomorrow. I remember seeing the Berlin Philharmonic. Was my very first trip to Europe, and it was back in '82. And I'd heard all the recordings, and the recordings, of course, were fabulous, but very perfected. But when I saw them live, it was really imperfect, but so energetic, and the musicians were playing like there was no tomorrow. And maybe during this time, when we're always, because of the recorded sound and the recording process, we're always trying to make things perfect, rather than real. And maybe we have to start to take more risks instead of making something perfect, that music making goes back to taking risks and just going for it. And sometimes you make it and sometimes you don't, but it is just a thrilling experience. And in different times in the 20th century, you look at like a Leonard Bernstein, like he had this ability to bring this life out in the music that was like it was no tomorrow. And when we start to go into everything, you don't want everything to be 72 degrees in the head. But sometimes when people don't take risks and artists don't take risks, it's all very fine, but you're not really living the music like you saw.
Sure.
You yourself experienced that. You'll never forget that concert for the rest of your life.
Right. And the feeling that this is live. This is happening now. I mean, sure, there's the sense that, something could screw up, the whole thing could go black, and a fire could start, and everything is crazy. But
somebody could come in at the wrong time. They could play a wrong note. Yeah. But who cares when it's that thrilling?
Because on the other side of it, that they may be doing something they've never done before. They may just find it just right. The conductor of the Kingston Symphony was giving a talk, I think, a few months ago, and he said that of all the times that he's done, I think it was Beethoven's Fifth, of all the times he's done it, he's only got it right once. Yeah. And very, very few people ever get it just right this one moment. And,
it's a lifelong quest.
Right. But
you never get it all.
Which is amazing because it's a piece of music that's 200 years old. Yeah. And it's been written down and studied by many, many, many people and heard by many people. And yet people are on this quest to get it just right. Yeah. And right is not mathematical. It's intuitive. Yeah. And I think that it's that sort of balance we have to strike in the arts between the scientific or the mathematical and the precise and the intuitive and the human and the almost maybe accidental that we have to search for.
And that creative time. I remember Tafel Music was recording, and recording is a very grueling process. You're basically working on 20 minutes of music over 4 hours. Wow. And the musicians were completely exhausted. And the conductor said, okay, well, let's just read through the sixth for tomorrow. We'll just do a read through. And all of a sudden, the most beautiful music making happened. And I was just backstage and I stopped in my track. I said, don't move, don't breathe. It was just so fabulous. And then right after, I ran back to the producer and he took his earphones saying, what just happened? The conductor ran back. Was it still rolling? Was it still rolling? And then the music director came in. Did we get it? Did we get that take? And it ended up to be the top take, but you never know when that brilliant moment is going to happen.
Right. But it seems like one of the ingredients is to relax and stop trying to be perfect.
And just let it happen.
Right. And maybe that's actually a lesson for an audience member too, for someone participating in things, rather than sitting on the edge of your seat and trying so hard to understand what it's trying to tell you. Just relax into it, almost like meditation. Maybe just let it happen to you. And if something grabs your attention, you won't have any choice but to sit up and be part of it. Like almost let it be boring until it's not anymore. Because if the artists are good, they won't let you sit back in your seat. No way. They'll drive you into it.
Yeah, this past year, we had Soundstreams do this very famous composer's work, Tan Dun, and it was The Water Passion. And it was the combination of Western and Chinese instruments and water. And it was so mesmerizing. And at first people came in, oh, it's the new work. I'm not sure if I'm going to like it. But we were all mesmerized by the end.
How do you bring new work to audiences? I mean, there's a lot of experimental stuff out there. There's a lot of work, whether in dance or drama or music, that maybe, I don't know, is too new, that people might find, I don't get it when they leave, but we still have to bring that in to keep things fresh and new and alive. How do you balance that?
Well, I try to take everybody on a journey, because if we just did the top hits, let's say through the ensemble series, after a while, people would say, been there, done that. And I always want people not to be able to predict what they're going to experience going in. So through a series, I try to bring them on a journey. So, you may hear the Beethoven piano sonatas, but then you're going to be exposed in another concert to something else, like we did the Quartet for the End of Time, the Messiaen, and the violinist just talked about this was actually created in a concentration camp. And when you first heard it, the very beginning was completely completely chaotic. But that's what it would have been like if you first walked into a concentration camp and all the norms thrown out the window. And so normally if people walked in and said, well, I would prefer her to hear Beethoven than Messiaen, but because they had been part of the journey, it made it really exciting. And I heard comments both ways. I heard, that's the most brilliant thing I've ever heard. And somebody was actually crying after. It was so beautiful. And another person said, well, it's that modern music. I don't really like it. But they're kind of glad that they went there and they're not bored and it's not just an ABC kind of programming. And then other things that we're doing, like we have Eva Goyen coming in with a very experimental program, part of our Innovators series, and we're partnering with the Tone Deaf Festival. So there's a group of people that really like very innovative experimental music. So that's great too. And so you try to have that kind of variety, but we talked about the ability to take risk, and there's so much material and ethos in our society of walking away from risk. We try to put the element of risk in there because as artists and audience members, we have to be able to take the risk to actually go to new vistas.
Right.
And even in arts councils, they were talking about how do you manage financial risk, and they were going so much in that direction that you just saw programming really start to be very risk averse and quite ordinary. And interestingly, by avoiding risk, you actually have the greater risk of an audience ultimately being bored and voting with their feet and walking away.
Of course, yeah. I mean, that just becomes sterile at that point. I mean, so we all know that an artist has to take risks not only to stay viable, but to make art. Art is by definition a risk. But I think there's also it's incumbent upon audiences to take a risk too, because with risk will come reward. If I go to something I might not otherwise see, I might see the world in a different way.
Exactly. And it's why we have subscription series. And, there's kind of the myth that, the subscriptions are no longer valid. And I don't believe that. I think subscriptions are great because what ends up happening is you take the journey and you go to something that you normally wouldn't go to as a single ticket buyer. If I said, would you like to go to Quartet for the End of Time by Messiaen? So I don't know if I want to shell out for that. But if it's part of your series, but that may have been the most moving moment in the entire series.
Right.
And I think that that's actually a mechanism to take people on a journey that goes beyond what they know. And we need to basically push ourselves beyond what we know to actually understand something a lot greater. And actually to have that experience of beauty that is a lot more 3D than two-dimensional.
You mentioned a lot of organizations don't do subscriptions anymore, or they're starting to phase it out. It's not the way of doing things. That's kind of a segue into a question about what is happening in the arts in Canada, in the Western world, in the world at large. How is it changing? How is the way we interact as consumers, as audience members with the art changing, both with social media, but also, if people don't subscribe so much anymore, what are they looking for? Are they seeing it purely as something to be consumed or something to participate in, say in social media? What's happening with the arts?
That's a very interesting question, because I think when you first start buying single tickets, you have a consumer relation sometimes with the art form. That's Handel's Messiah. I'm going to go to Handel's Messiah, or any artist. And so what brings you into that relationship with the art form? And it usually has something to do with frequency. So what you see arts organizations doing is basically making the audience member the curator of their own series. So we have our Pick 5 series, for example, but it means that people who have an eclectic taste can actually choose whatever they want to choose to actually curate their own way on their own terms. And I think that when you see that in the arts, that's actually given a lot more flexibility for people to see what they want to see. They may not want to see all one thing. They may want variety, or they may want a certain day of the week, whatever it is. But I think giving people a lot more flexibility. And with social media, we actually have the ability to give people a lot of information, have kind of a pre-experience before the live experience through social media, through YouTube films, and a lot of information that can give information about the artist, so that that person is actually curious about the artist beyond just the performer, but also what they are like as a human being, and what their whole philosophy of making art is communicated before the artist comes on stage. So there is a greater understanding before you go in, and hopefully a greater curiosity as to what that individual artist is going to bring to you, rather than what you think that artist should be doing.
That's an interesting concept, actually, that people are worried, for example, that the arts are losing the battle against Netflix, right? But they've been saying that for over 100 years.
Yeah.
Right?
They said that about radio.
Right, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
They said that about radio,
Yeah.
about television,
No.
about the internet. I mean, people have always said this, and it never materializes. So what is it about the arts in person? What is it about seeing music in person? What is it about seeing a play in person that is different from putting a record on or listening to YouTube or watching a movie? What's the difference?
I think the big difference is that communal experience. We don't have that many mechanisms now to experience something together. And there's an energy in the audience that is given to the artist and vice versa. And when that magic happens, the magic is actually the meeting of the artist with that audience, and it's absolutely thrilling when that happens. And just like your experience that you'll never forget, you have this experience, but you're experiencing it with everybody together, and there's some kind of beauty. Like, take the Gord Downie, last Gord Downie concert. We were all experiencing it together. I was in Market Square, people were at the K-Rock Centre, people across the country. We were all experiencing it together. There was something quite magnificent about that was different than just going onto YouTube and finding Tragically Hip and listening to that way.
Right.
We knew it was a special moment that would never, ever be repeated.
And there's community too.
Exactly.
Right. There's a sense of communion that we are doing this together.
Yeah.
And what could be more important in such turbulent times than finding or rediscovering a sense of doing something as a group of people, as one.
I remember the opening of the season a few years ago with the Kingston Symphony. They played "O Canada," and it was kind of a sad time with Canada. There had been some policies that put in place, like the barbaric practices and all of that. And we all sang "O Canada" together, and we realized how much we loved our country. But it was singing that together that kind of gave us this faith that we can make our country better. We can do better, but we did that together because we were all in the room together. It was one of those unexpected emotional moments that happened.
And therefore, art, both in terms of creating community, but also in terms of the stories that it tells, can be a unifying force. Can bring people together and cross barriers that maybe seemed impossible before.
Exactly. I remember I was in Berlin, and I heard the Berlin Symphony, not the Berlin Philharmonic, but the Berlin Symphony in the concert house. And they were playing Mahler's Second, and it was this fantastic acoustic. And all of a sudden, this very, very triple forte part happened, and I felt like my whole air column was vibrating at the same frequency. And so another reason why live music is different is that your body physically reacts differently than it does through recorded music. You're surrounded by the music, you're surrounded by the vibrations, and there's something really real about that moment. And something really special that you, when it's a really fabulous concert, you think, I can't believe I'm here. I can't believe I'm here like this, and it's going to disappear in 2 hours.
Yeah.
You never be able to repeat that special experience, and that is very different than listening to a recording. And I'm a big fan of recordings. At Tafel Music, I formed the Tafel Music Media recording label, so the great thing about recordings is it gets out to millions of people around the world and it really improves the game of musicians because they're working so hard to make it as best as they can. But I think there's a role for both, so I don't see Netflix and the internet as competition, but it's actually part of our artistic and cultural experience. But it cannot replace the live experience. If you heard Kennedy's inaugural speech, if you were there live, that's much different than watching it on YouTube.
Well, rather than taking a competitive approach, we could say that Netflix and YouTube and even going back to CDs. Well, not only that, but it actually can enhance the experience.
Exactly.
For me, the best concerts of classical music that I've enjoyed were ones that I not only heard the music before, but maybe heard 100 times before and loved that one moment and played it over and over. And then to see live an orchestra do it and see how they do it. It's not even that I'm not a musician. I can't read music. I don't really know what the bars are or how many instruments are playing, but I do know what the sound is like. Yeah. And it's almost that my expectation is being not frustrated by, but enhanced by a new experience. And so if the fact that millions and millions of people can hear something before they go to see it live can actually enhance the experience.
I think so too, because it's our when the bottom fell out of the recording market in the late 90s, and so a lot of orchestras stopped recording.
Right.
But that was to their detriment because before that, when a lot of recording activity was happening, it was everybody's 24/7 activity to be listening to music.
Right.
And when they took that out, you saw a tremendous dip in attendance because it wasn't part of everybody's everyday habit. We were basically saying you're supposed to show up on Thursday night from 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock and go home, and we don't want that. We want music to be part of everybody's daily habit. I listen to music all the time. I find it thrilling. Sometimes people say, "Oh, classical music, it's relaxing," but that's actually not my experience. Some pieces may be relaxing, but I just find it so stimulating, and it kind of gets the creative juices going in terms of ideas when you start to listen to it, and especially when you've discovered a piece that you know and really interpret it in a different way, or when you've discovered a composer that you've never heard before and you're totally blowing it away. Like there's a contemporary composer, James Macmillan, and he did this beautiful work called The Seven Last Words of Christ, and there's this beautiful violin solo. But I thought, why haven't I heard of James Macmillan? Shame on me. This is really, really beautiful.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that there's a feeling when I'm listening to music that I want it to move me. Yeah. But I also want it to maybe make me want to dance. I know. And so when I knew that I liked Beethoven truly was when I realized he made me want to move and dance. Yeah. And I know that sounds completely silly, and a lot of people are probably rolling their eyes. But for me, the feeling that my body wants to move to it, and I understand it on
that's
that
a sign, right?
Physical level. Yeah, I think it is. And I also think we talk about community and the creation of a community in a performance. I used to work in the theater for a long time, and we talked a lot about how you could feel when the audience was breathing together. You could feel when they were with you, maybe even breathing with you. Yeah. But it always kind of seemed hokey. Yeah. It just seemed like a really nice idea. But that's about all it is. But studies have actually shown more recently that audiences not only do breathe together, but if they sit in communion over a piece of music, like we probably did 100,000 years ago as a tribe around the campfire, that our hearts beat together. Yeah. That we're actually in physical communion, not just by being next to each other, but we're in the same rhythm together. Yeah. And I think that is a profound, if not explanation, at least elucidation of what the arts can be, what they can achieve, and what they can't achieve on Netflix or YouTube.
And also when you hear the silence in an audience. I remember Wen Zhao, a Chinese pipa player who lives in Toronto, and every time she played, whether it was for a student audience or an adult audience or a tour audience, she was so mesmerizing. You could just hear a pin drop, and there's something magic in the silence that we're so used to ambient noise. And when that ambient noise goes away, you know when something's beautiful, that everybody almost stops breathing because it's so beautiful. Mm-hmm. And I remember we had toured with throat singers to China, and the audience was so fascinated with throat singing. The musicians could actually see the audiences smiling so much, and we said, okay, next time we're going to be your backup band, because they related so beautifully to the audience, and it was such an interesting experience. And the throat singers were so generous with the audience and teaching them how, and having a much more participatory kind of relationship with audiences than classical music does.
Right.
And so it really was one of those beautiful moments.
Yeah, and I think that, whether we're looking for virtuoso or virtuosity in a performer, or we're looking for them to be telling us the story, or we're looking for them to be doing something that I already know a little bit about, which I think is important too. So, I really enjoy listening to Shostakovich, but part of the reason why is because I know the story behind a lot of his music. So his Fifth Symphony, for example, when it was first performed in what was at the time Leningrad, people wept in the audience. The whole, from what I understand, the whole audience was in tears. They knew what he was trying to say, even though there's not a single word in there. People today might have a completely different meaning, but they knew that for this premiere performance of that symphony, what they were saying. And it was, of course, during the time of Stalin and the purges and total disruption in that society in the Soviet Union.
And the sarcasm in the last movement towards power.
Yes, and for me...
And the beauty of the slow movement that was just so heartbreaking.
Right, and I've played that. I've played that for people before and said, okay, listen to it once, and what do you hear? And then listen to it again, but this time listen to this at the end. Listen to the strings. That they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And they don't stop, and it sounds like the rest of the orchestra is trying to shut them up. Like, be quiet, be quiet. No, stop protesting. But the strings go on and on and on, and there's a sense there of story. And now, the story at the time may have been about Stalin, but we could certainly see that story being about something else today as well.
It's so powerful, and I think we have in our human quest this really great joy of discovery, whether it's going into space, but when you discover that moment, the time that you discovered Shostakovich's Fifth, there's something that brings such an essential joy to that curious mind of yours, right? Right.
And to match curiosity with an artist who is willing to not only satisfy it, but also open it up to new avenues too. And so that, the best, for a lot of people, the best play you can see is one that really begins as soon as the curtain goes down. That really the play begins in your mind once the play is done.
Right.
What are you thinking about?
It stays with you.
Right. And you got to talk to somebody about it. You have to have a conversation. You have to think this through.
That's such an interesting thing, because I always know when a concert and an artist is really connecting, because the pitch of the audience at intermission is actually higher.
Really?
People are really, they're talking, they're excited, and they're not talking, I got to get to my car, I'm worried about parking, whatever. All of a sudden, they're talking about the concert, but it's a different pitch in the lobby at that time, because it's so thrilling, and people want it, they've had that communal sharing, and they want to talk about it.
They're almost, itching in their seat to go and do so. I wonder if you would... if you'd want to get like a recording of your intermissions and compare them and see which had the highest pitch and which had the most energy. That would be a fascinating study, even if it was, isolated to this community.
It's pretty exciting to see, but we all know it, and we all know, because it's the experience in the end, you can't capture it. The only way you can capture it is actually being there and having it stay inside you. And so everybody knows that if I wasn't there, I would not have had that experience. And I also think when you can tell when artists reach new plateaus together, that they're, working on a piece and they've done a number of times, but there's this growth that happens, but all of a sudden they really jump to a completely new plateau, and they know it, and the audience knows it, and that is just absolutely thrilling to see, because they've actually discovered something. So it's almost like that childlike excitement of, the reason why you started to be a musician. It actually activates that part of being able to actually discover new parts of music and be completely thrilled by it. And I noticed, just even on the arts admin side, that the people who keep that great curiosity and thrill of being part of the arts all their lives, they actually stay in the arts. People that lose that, they end up going into different fields.
Right.
Because it's a tough world being in the arts, you know? There's
Sure.
a lot of challenges. And as an artist, it's very challenging every time trying to do your best. And, you know, you're making yourself vulnerable to public criticism. You have your good and bad days. It's a tough life. But the beautiful part is so beautiful that you would never give it up.
Well, it's tough too because it's sometimes hard to explain what it is you do.
Right.
You know, I mean, for years, many artists have to maybe work in a cafe or a restaurant to make ends meet.
Yeah.
And when someone asks them what they do and they say, I'm an actor or a musician, a lot of people just kind of, you know, put up their eyebrows and say, sure.
What's your real job?
Right. And how long are you going to do this before you face reality?
Yeah.
Because of the perceptions of what people have about the arts.
I think also innocently that people attend arts events after their workday, so they assume that would be the same for the people on stage. And so I think,
really,
but you look at how hard artists work, whether they're dancers or actors or musicians or visual artists, how hard they work and the standards they put towards what they do is really important. And I notice that, you know, a lot of people get training in the arts and they'll go on, not always to be performing artists because it's quite a Darwinian world, only the best survive. But people who've been trained in the arts actually take that training into what they do and that quest to make it even better and better and better.
Right.
And I remember I did a Bachelor of Music and then I went back to school and did an MBA, and we had a group that we had to do a lot of group projects with. And so they said, oh, this is good enough. I said, no, but we know it's not good enough. We know we can do better. But that was the artist training of good enough. You don't say, oh, good enough for Mozart, whatever.
Right.
You actually try to make something the best you can possibly do.
That's the nature of art in a way. So with all of this in mind, what are you most excited about at the Isabel Bader in the coming months, weeks?
I think I'm most excited about the Cataraqui Festival of Indigenous Arts. We've been working with Dylan Robinson, who's Queen's Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Arts, and he's a fantastic curator. And so that is going to be an amazing journey. We've got the National Arts Centre doing a musical and multimedia rendition of Rita Joe's I Lost My Talk. We've got Digging Roots coming in. We've got a bunch of new creations and people coming in the summer working on new creations to be performed. And also in affiliation is the Agnes's Soundings exhibit that's a very imaginatively animated exhibit that's happening there. So I think that is going to be a very exciting part. And also just a number of the musicians coming through. There's a fantastic Korean pianist, Sungjin Cho, who won the Chopin competition and has toured with the Berlin Philharmonic. And I can hardly wait to hear him because he's such a dynamic young player. So I've always been a champion of trying to make sure that we're supporting emerging artists and the next generation of arts leaders. And so when I see some of the players coming in, I can hardly wait to hear them play. And each generation has a different take on music. And so I love hearing that, having that variety of different generations bringing their own life experiences into the music, and it changes it.
Right. Sounds like things are moving up. Like it sounds like things are actually building to a crescendo in your world.
Exactly. And you know, it is a lifelong learning experience, especially in programming, because you come in with one idea and then you start to talk to different people in the field and have these great exchanges with artists, and all of a sudden the programming has new depths. We have a Kingston series and really engaging the community in what's happening with Kingston artists, because we have so many talented artists in Kingston. And at the Isabel, instead of we never want it to be just kind of a roadhouse. It's got to have a soul and a purpose, and that's what we're trying to do. But it only happens if there is an inclusive aspect to programming and not just one kind of programming. It has to be diversified, and it has to really showcase artists of different genres and different cultures and different ages.
Tricia, thank you so much for coming on the program. This has been a terrific conversation.
Oh, this has been amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's the show. Remember to check out the website, www.wogoshow.com, for more. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please take a second to share it on social media and give the show a rating on iTunes or Facebook. Your quote of the week is from an Irish dramatist and critic, George Bernard Shaw. It's from a collection of 5 plays plus a preface that was first published in 1921. You might recognize this publication as the source of another Shaw quote, which goes, "You see things as they are and say, why? But I dream things that never were and say, why not?" Today, for the price of one, you're going to get 2 Shaw quotes, so here's your quote of the week. "You use a glass mirror to see your face. You use works of art to see your soul." Thanks for listening.